I'm a cemetery operations coordinator, or you can just call me a cemetery manager. Part of my job is sitting down with guests and family members of the deceased to set up funerals, facilitate the sales of plots. A 30-something-year-old man named Claude, a very spiritual man, once sat down with me to purchase a plot for his sick father who was in hospice care. Claude was a Hispanic man with a very thick accent, and I saw in his eyes he was a very caring man. He showed me pictures of his father, who also looked like a very sweet man, much too young to be taken away from his family. Unfortunately, the man's time came that same week, and Claude arranged for his father's funeral service at the cemetery. It was a very stormy day, the day of the funeral, which is thought to be a sign of good luck. The funeral procession stopped in front of the front office building briefly. I stepped outside under the front awning of the building and saw Claude in the car behind the hearse. We waved at each other. Due to the weather, I went back inside until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. I got in one of the cemetery pickup trucks and followed the procession to the final stop where I would stand with my umbrella, supervising, as part of my job is making sure funeral services go smoothly. After the funeral, I did some laps around the place in the truck just to survey the area, as I did at least a couple times a day. I had a lot of paperwork to take care of, and on top of this, I had to close the cemetery that night. So, a little later, I went back to my desk and took care of this. The cemetery closes at 5:30, so as soon as it started to get dark, I drove around the place one more time to ensure all visitors had left, then drove over to the front gate to shut it. It was a relatively warm early March. The days were still on the shorter side, so by closing time on a normal day, it would already be getting darker, but on this stormy day, it already felt like it was nighttime. I was driving back to my office when I thought I saw someone hurriedly walking down one of the lanes of tombstones before turning behind a hedge and disappearing out of sight. I beeped my horn to let them know the place was closed, but strangely enough, I didn't see them again. I grabbed my umbrella and ran out into the rain in that direction. I turned beyond the hedge they turned at and looked down this long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other. I didn't see anyone. I looked around in the rain for a solid 20 minutes, but eventually, I had to give up. I drove back up to the office and browsed through the CCTV footage. None of it picked up any unusual movement, even though it was a bit harder to see much because of the storm, and it was also pitch black outside now. I tried to multitask, keeping an eye on the camera while finishing up some of my paperwork, when I heard the front door to the visitation room slammed shut. I sprang up from my chair and yelled, "Hello." My first thought was that it was the same person I saw before. Maybe they got locked in the cemetery and were looking for assistance in leaving. I stepped out into the lobby, but no one was there. I looked around and again said, "Hello." Maybe the door slamming shut was them leaving. I started looking out all the windows, and I stopped when, through one of them, I saw someone on the other side looking back at me with a blank expression. I jumped back and screamed, and they didn't flinch. I stepped closer and made a squinty-eyed, confused look when I realized I recognized this Hispanic, older-looking man. In my head, it reminded me exactly of the pictures of Claude's father he showed me. With my heart in my throat, I ran out the front door of the building and to the side where I saw the man, but he was gone. He wasn't booking it into the fields, he wasn't hiding in a bush nearby, he was gone. I looked around me as I stood in the rain getting soaked, then ran back inside, packed up my things, locked up, and got in my car. I opened and closed the gate once more, locking it behind me, and drove home. When my wife asked me at home why I was being so quiet, I just told her it was a long day at work. To this day, I think I was just overworking myself, and my mind was playing tricks on me, but it still is genuinely disturbing to think about. My friends and I were very stupid when we were teenagers. I was like 16 or 17 when this happened. It was the month of October, and I wanted to do something scary in the spirit of Halloween. There's a small cemetery about 15 minutes from where I live, and when I was drunk with a couple of friends, I said we should sneak into it. I'll make up some names for my friends, Dion and Ezra. We were at Dion's house. He didn't drink ever, so when I came up with the idea, he was the one to drive us to the cemetery. Ezra and I were really the ones leading this. Dion was just along for the ride. But then again, he hadn't been drinking. Dion parked in some parking lot across the street. It was a ghost town because it was past midnight at that point. We made sure no one was around to see us as we hopped the fence into the cemetery. It wasn't exactly pitch black out, but it was slightly hard to see more than 10 feet in front of us, so we were all using our iPhone flashlights. There didn't appear to be any night security in the cemetery, so we kind of dispersed from each other. Dion seemed to be following Ezra more closely. I could still see where they were because of their flashlights. I went off a little further on my own and decided I'd start taking a creepy video. So I started recording with the lights still on, of course. I recorded a bunch of old headstones and the general eerie vibe of the cemetery at night. I didn't see Ezra and Dion anymore, so I started to go look for them, still recording. I looked at my phone screen and froze. There was a woman dressed in a white gown or a dress, I want to say, with long gray-looking hair. She was looking down at the ground. I looked up from my phone screen to look at her in person, but she was gone. I started to back away. I looked back at my phone screen, and there she was again, only now she was looking into the camera, or rather looking at me. I looked up from the phone again and could not see her once more, so I looked back down at the screen again, and there I could see her moving closer to me. I started to scream for Ezra and Dion as I sprinted away from that spot. I couldn't see their lights anywhere. They weren't answering my screams. I had a feeling they were going to try to scare me, so I ran back for the fence of the cemetery to hop it and get out. I made it to Dion's car and texted the two of them, saying they need to get out of the cemetery now. They met me at the car minutes later. We all sat in a car, and I showed them the video I took. They had the same horrified looks on their faces I did. Now that I was actually watching the whole video, I could see the moment the woman slowly lifted her head from looking at the ground to looking at me, and then she starts to move towards me. We could only see her moving for like a second or two before I start screaming in the video and running away. But the way she was moving, we could see no leg movement. It almost seemed as though she were floating to me. I had that video saved on my old iPhone 5S, but the stupid thing won't turn on. It gets stuck at the Apple logo. I don't want to reset that phone until I can get that video off of it somehow. My friends firmly believe the woman in the video was a real living person who also happened to be in the cemetery that night, but me, having been the one to actually find her and only being able to see her on my phone screen, well, let's just say I was never a believer in the paranormal until that night foreign. I'll never forget when I worked nighttime security at a cemetery for about 2 weeks. It was never something I wanted to do as a security guard, but I didn't have a choice. The agency I worked for forced me to transfer due to an incident where I allegedly assaulted a kid who happened to have rich parents while doing my job. I'm not allowed to talk about that case, though, so I won't. I didn't want to work at a cemetery for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, my boss told me to accept the transfer or resign from the agency, and I wasn't ready to be out of a job. The cemetery in question was the oldest in the city, and it was considered historic. However, it had just signed a contract for nighttime security after a couple of grave robberies that had recently occurred. It only happened twice in recent history, but in the span of a couple of weeks, which indicated that it might happen again. Aside from the daytime toll with workers, I was the first security guard to work there, which meant I had nobody before me to tell me how things might go. I couldn't instill the first night, so I made a lot of walkabouts to the burial grounds in an effort to desensitize myself from how damn spooky it was in the dark. It had the opposite effect, though. At one point, I came across one of the graves that had been robbed. It was already refilled, although the grass hadn't been recovered yet. The marker was eroded, but I could tell that it was a woman who had lived to be pretty old. I paid my respects and I walked on without thinking much of it. Over the course of a few nights, nothing happened. It was one of the more boring starts to a job that I've had. I was used to getting off work around 4 or 5 a.m. at the latest, but I was in the graveyard from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., 3 nights a week, and that schedule didn't suit me. I became extremely drowsy halfway through each shift, and the coffee available in the booth was like water to me. When I went back for my second round of shifts, I was already over it. There was nobody around to notice, though, so I didn't care. I was through with my first week, so I figured my supervisors would be more relaxed about watching over the camera footage. Instead of trying to force myself to stay awake when I was exhausted and nothing was happening, I let myself sleep when I felt like it. I didn't think the grave robbers would actually come back and try their luck for a third time once they knew I was there, and it's not like I had a problem stealing company time from the agency that screwed me over. However, there was one party who had a problem with me sleeping on the job. The last night I worked there, I was exhausted from the previous shifts and it didn't take too long for me to start dozing off in my chair. I actually fell into a deep enough sleep to start dreaming. I don't remember how the dream started, but I know that at some point it suddenly became a nightmare. I'd laid down thinking I was about to get a massage or something, only to feel immense pain in my stomach. I screamed and opened my eyes to see an elderly woman standing above me with a shovel, plunging it into my abdomen and digging out my insides. I couldn't move, and all I could do was watch her eviscerate me. It was the most vivid dream that I've ever had. Luckily, I was able to force myself awake. I opened my eyes with a start. Then, right there on the other side of the booth window, I saw that same decrepit old woman staring right at me. I jumped back and fell off the chair, losing sight of her for a second. When I got to my feet, she was gone, but I was thoroughly shaken. I was terrified by the thought of going out there, but I knew it was my job to go looking for anyone who attempted to trespass. To be honest, I didn't feel any safer being a sitting duck in the toll booth. I stepped outside into the cold under a full moon and turned on my flashlight, throwing the beam in every direction. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then my heart skipped a beat when I saw a figure standing near the back of the property by the trees. I shouted at them, but they didn't respond. I had to look away for a second as I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, but it was thankfully just a possum that I startled into running off. That was logical and reassuring, although there was still that mysterious figure standing by the woods. But, of course, when I looked back, she was gone. I couldn't understand how such a frail old woman was covering so much ground, but I marched over to where I last saw her without thinking about it. I had to walk across the entire graveyard to get to the back of the property. Along the way, it seemed like every single creature in the woods was going insane. I heard flocks of birds suddenly take flight from all the trees at once. An owl let out one of those awful screeches that they make. Even a pack of coyotes started to go haywire in the distance. I felt like all the forces in nature were warning me not to keep going, but in my gut, I was worried that if I stopped walking, something else would happen. So I pressed on until I finally got to the edge of the graveyard. I looked around with a flashlight and called out to the person I saw, but I didn't see or hear anyone. Then, as quickly as it all had started, all the noises in the woods stopped. Every single animal fell silent, even the bugs went quiet. I muttered to myself in confusion and started to turn around. But that's when I noticed I was standing right on top of one of the graves that had been robbed, the one of the old woman that I'd seen the week before. As soon as I realized this, I felt stiff hands wrap around my throat and my feet were kicked out from under me. I couldn't see who was doing this to me, but they were strong as hell. They bashed my face into the recently replaced dirt probably a dozen times until it started to feel like I was about to pass out from lack of oxygen. Then, at the last second, it stopped. I felt the rough touch of the hand simply disappear. I quickly got to my feet in a panic, but I couldn't see anyone in the area. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, but there was no way that I could have. It felt as real as anything else. Whatever it was had me chilled to the bone. I didn't finish my shift that night. I ran to my car with my tail between my legs and quit the job on the spot. This event has haunted me ever since. I've pieced together what it meant over the years. The spirit of the old woman who was robbed didn't take kindly to me slacking on the job, and she took matters into her own hands to make sure it never happened again. I've never been a superstitious person, but sometimes things happen in life that make you reevaluate your assumptions. Even now, when I'm at work and I feel myself getting the urge to slack off, I see that woman out of the corner of my eye for a split second, reminding me of the lesson she taught me. I work at a cemetery on the edge of my town. It's a small one, being only a few acres of land. I'd been working there for a year at the time, and I hated every minute of it. Not really because it was a cemetery, but just because it was boring. I was alone all night and sat in a small room for most of the time. There were 2 cameras set up on either side of the yard and one on the entrance of the tiny building I was in. My boss always told me that my job was to just be there, and if anything actually happens, then to call the police and let them take care of it. In the whole year before this, not a single thing happened. Again, it was a small cemetery in a small town, so not a lot of action was expected. On a Monday evening, I pulled into the parking lot and relieved my coworker from his day shift. I hadn't slept the best that day, so I brought a cup of coffee to help keep me up. For the first hour, I was sipping on my coffee and watching the cameras while also scrolling through my phone a bit. Come 1 a.m., I started to get really drowsy. I was nodding off in my chair, and the coffee wasn't really helping either. In the middle of the hour, I guess I fully fell asleep. What I think was 20 or so minutes later, I woke up to an odd sound, metal creaking behind me. I swiveled around in my chair. The door to my building was cracked open, swaying slightly from the wind outside. My heart hurt from the strike of fear it gave me. I got up and pulled the door further open, peeking my head outside and looking around. Nobody was in sight. I slammed the door firmly shut and made sure it was fully locked. It could have been a simple mistake, not fully closing the door, but it got my hair standing up. I rolled back the footage outside the building and didn't see anyone coming up to the building. At least after this, I was wide awake. I was constantly checking each camera. About 10 minutes later, I saw something move on the screen. It was the camera on the far end of the yard. Someone was walking through the cemetery. I watched as they slowly made their way past several gravestones, then stopped. I waited a few seconds before picking up the phone and dialing 911, still keeping my eyes on the screen. I spoke softly into the phone, telling the operator that I worked at the cemetery and there was a man trespassing. The woman on the phone started responding when suddenly the man sprinted through the yard and off of the screen. I let out an uncontrollable gasp, moving my eyes all around the other cameras looking for him. A second later, he appeared on the other screen, sprinting past it again, and not long after, he appeared on the screen showing the outside of the building I was in. I told the woman what was going on, that I needed to be quiet. I put the phone down and stared at the camera. It was a man who was now standing right outside the door. Then he looked around at the face of the building before locking his eyes on the camera. It made me shiver, seeing him stare at the camera as if he could see me through the screen. "Hello? Can you help me?" I heard his muffled voice from the other side of the door. Then, without even waiting for an answer, he walked around to the back of the building. There were no cameras on that side, but I could hear his footsteps in the grass. He sounded like he was walking right up against the wall. Then out of nowhere, I heard his footsteps departing quickly. My heart was racing all the way up until the police came. I thought I'd sound crazy, but they found very defined shoe prints in the grass. They followed them far off, way past the cemetery border, but lost the trail before it led anywhere else. The man's behavior was very odd, and the way he asked for help was even odder. I don't know if the door being opened earlier was somehow him, but I don't know what to believe anymore. Despite being scared shitless, I continued working and still work there. Nothing else has happened, and the man never returned, but I don't think I'll ever fall asleep at the cemetery again. When I was 18, my friend Dash, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand, and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that. Still, we had no school the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The tombstones were very archaic looking, and any time we'd pass, there would be no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last decade. The site probably dated back centuries and had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a Gothic metal fence and surrounded by woods on two sides, the road on one, and some old abandoned building on the other. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. It took a little persuading, but Dash managed to get me to want to check it out too. Ironically, it was a very cloudy, reddish kind of day, conveniently adding to the mood. Dash pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low-traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road, and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the little cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Dash kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. He led us through the eerie little plot of land, and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I know it sounds super dumb and cliché, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Dash how creepy this was. "I know," he replied. Still with the feeling of being watched, I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery, at one of the windows. For a brief moment, I knew I saw someone standing at the window, even through the fog, smudge, and dirt on the glass. But they casually either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Dash we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him, "Don't." I said we should just leave before we get in trouble. I stayed still by the tombstone he was looking at while he walked around a building, and then he found a way in. He called me over, but I stayed put. I heard some loud kind of crack, so I looked in that direction, and there was this older man, probably around 55. Gray hair, had on a black raincoat, I believe he was wearing jeans, and he had a mustache, but that's all I really got of him. Then he opened his mouth and screamed. Not just yelled, he screamed, "Get out." He screamed it so loud I thought I saw birds fly away from being startled. Just like that, I started to feel lightheaded, and suddenly everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out, thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned and got up, I saw it was just Dash. Dash was freaking out about something. He told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me, and when I turned, I realized we were being followed by someone. So I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Dash was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't get to see anything else in the building because he heard the old man scream at me outside. He came running to find me passed out on the floor, and he saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually literally picked me up and threw me over the fence to get me out. I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted one time in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building right next to it makes it that much stranger. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.